All right, in this video, we're going to start setting up for Ashley to be able to do collision management, since we want something that's going to be more robust and it's not just everything's colliding, but we can choose what we want to collide as we're passing it in, creating the bodies. Then we want basically a system set in place so that we can find what is colliding, and then we can choose what we want to happen to it. So that we're actually going to be building as a manager. This could probably also be built as a system, but for the main piece, we need basically to have a method in place to track when collisions happen or when contacts happen. Okay, so let's create a new class. We'll call it Collision Manager, and it's going to implement the contact listener. So instead of having what we had implemented before with Box2D, we're having this where it's actually running all these pieces. All right, so we got to implement the methods. All right, now there's 4 methods that it does. There's begin contact, where we can, so for Box2D, we can have it set where it's passing us that information. So as soon as a contact happens, as soon as 2 bodies touch each other, we can have stuff happen for when we end the contact. There are a couple other ones, the pre-solve and pre-solve and post-solve. Those, you're doing it while it's actually happening. And most of the time, I've always just left those blank. Okay. So in begin contact, what we actually want to happen, and let's just go ahead and add a debug line because we know it's going to come up. gdx.net.log and contact. Okay, so we're going to set this up. Now, this is all based off of fixtures because your Box2D doesn't really do anything. It's the fixtures that are colliding. So we're going to have a couple fixtures. Now, let's just call it fixture FA. I need to import. Okay, and that would be with Box2D, there's always 2 fixtures that you're going to have. You're going to have a fixture A, fixture B. Okay, so I'm just going to call them. The problem is we don't know which one is fixture A and fixture B. So we have to basically set up so that we can deal with who has collided with who. So I could start trying to set up and do that, but I find that if we can just do some if statements and just check, we can build what we want to happen. So let's do if FA, so that's the fixture, and then we want to get the body that fixture belongs to, and get user data, because that's what we set when we were creating the bodies. We set the user data for the Ashley entity, and we're just going to ask if it's an instance of the Ashley entity class. So I need to make sure that I have that selected. Okay. If that is true, then entity, let's just call it entity, is equal to, and I'm going to have to cast this, entity fa.getBody.getUserData. Okay. So I'm basically casting because the user data was the Ashley entity that we created. We know this, so we're explicitly casting it as an entity. Okay. And then we have to have the other way. So else if, so we already know that fixture A is not the entity, then we're going to want to deal with fixture B being that box 2D body. So get body dot get user data instance of entity, and basically writing the same thing but the other way around. Then entity is equal to, and then I have to cast this one, so it'd be entity fb dot get body dot get user data. Okay. So now what we need though is we need to be able to set where we can link up those components. What we have is we have our collision component right here. So what we want to do is we want to store the entity that got collided with the owner of this collision component to have a reference to who collided with it. So that's what we're basically going to do, but we're going to create a method to do that. So let's do private void entity collision, and we're just going to have an entity that goes in there and a fixture. Okay, so once we have that, then we can say if fixture dot get body dot get user data is the instance of entity, then that entity will be my collision entity. So then I have to cast that one. So entity fixture dot get body dot get user data. Okay. And then we are going to want to pull for the collision component. So collision component, let's just call this collision A, and that's going to be equal to the entity that we're passing in, get component, collision component dot class. All right. And then I'm going to be doing basically the same thing, but for the other one. So collision component, let's do collision B, and that's not entity, it's going to be the collision entity. Get component. Okay, so basically, and let's see, what else do I need? If collision A is not null, then I want to set collision A dot set collided entity to the collision entity. Okay, and then else if collision B is not null, then I want to set collision B set collided entity to the entity. Okay, yep, that's what I want. Okay. All right, so now we have a method. Let me kind of explain. So we're going to pass in an entity, and then we have a fixture that it has collided with. So we're checking to make sure if that fixture belongs to an Ashley entity, then that's our collided entity that we're setting. So now we have our collision components. which are from our entity and our collision entity, each of them should have, if they're a box 2D body, should have a collision component attached to them. So if it is not null, that means that they have a collision component, then we are going to set it to what it collided with. Only if it is not null. So if this ends up being that the collided entity was not a box 2D body, does not have a collision component attached to it, or I don't want to track that they were collided with, then I don't need to try to store it anywhere. So that's why I'm using this. If it's not null, then I'm going to store it, okay? So then here in my if statements, I can call that method. So let's do entity collision. But then I can kind of flip-flop on what I'm passing in. So in this case, entity was fixture A. Okay, so I'm in here, I'm passing in an entity and a fixture. So if FA, fixture A was basically the first thing that got generated for the collision, then that's what I'm going to want to call for this method. So entity collision, this would be entity, and then I would put FB in here. Otherwise, I'm doing the opposite. If FB was the one that collided, is registering the collision for box 2D, then I need to do it the other way around. So entity collision, and this time I am passing in this entity right here, but this is from fixture B, so then that means fixture A was the colliding entity. Okay, so seems kind of complex, but for Ashley, this is almost just going to be a super generic. We can use it for almost any game that we are creating, and will work. So the only other thing that we could maybe do is that we could have another log message. So we have our begin contact, our end contact. Let's just do end contact. Outside of that, we don't really need this collision manager for anything else. We don't need to have, when it registers an end contact, you could put something in there. But really what we're needing is as soon as there is a collision, we need it to get passed to enter that stuff into our collision component. Class is the collided entity, and then we can build a system that's going to let us deal with those situations. Okay, so that is for our collision manager, which plugging that into our game is really when we create the world. So the last piece that we would do to link that up is when we create the world, we're also going to have to set that up. So let me have a reference to that. Where do I put my world? Okay, so box 2D, private, collision manager, and then when I create the world, that's when I'm going to want to do it. So I'm going to do collision manager is equal to new collision manager, and then I'm going to go to the world, and that is what I want to be my contact listener. So set contact listener, and then I pass in that contact listener, which would be my collision manager. Okay, so now that is registered for dealing with all of those interactions and what I want to happen. So I can still have them interact, but now I'm throwing data for me to use in a number of different ways other than just having the automatic filters. So I can track if the player has run into an enemy, instead of them just being able to collide Now I can track when that happens, and then I can take away points from the player or health and have it more as a game. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video here. The next piece would be building that system. Yeah, we'll build a collision system for being able to deal with that situations, and then we'll start looking at a level collision generator. Actually, we might do the level collision generator first and then circle back for the collision system. All right, have fun.